In this video, we're going to cover one of the most important documents called the assumption log that we have to create and also update from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project during any project execution. So let us look at the actual definition of an assumption log. All right. So as you can see on the screen, an assumption is a factor in the planning process that are considered to be true, real, or even certain without proof or demonstration. So let me explain on this. Assumption is something that you want to consider to be true, okay, to be real or not to be changing even during the course of the project. For example, you can assume that the equipment is going to be available on time. You can also assume that the same project team is going to be maintained throughout the project. You can also even assume that none of the expected risk in terms of, say, financial risk is going to be expected. So what it means is you are making something true without providing proof. So what does that mean? It means at one point or the other during the project, this has to be validated, and you should always put a date to validate the assumption so that you don't keep something which might end up being a risk, because an assumption can be noticed today. It can be also logged in the assumption log, but later on it can turn into a risk, assuming you were expecting the team to be the same, but now there are some resignations, some are being recalled back to some functional departments, and so on and so forth. So you end up with a risk. If an assumption is actually something that has already happened, then it becomes an issue. So it's quite important to understand that an assumption is something that is considered to be true, to be real, and also certain without providing any proof or any demonstrations. So that is very, very important. Then a constraint is considered to be a limiting factor that affect the execution of a project, such as predetermined budgets or fixed milestones. So let me expand a bit on this. Constraints, they're always everywhere. In every project environment, you always find some constraints. It could be a resource constraint, which could be a human or non-human. It could be a financial constraint, which could be budget budget. It could be a financial constraint, which could be budget. It can also be a constraint in terms of schedule. You're supposed to deliver something in 6 months. You can't go beyond that, especially when it comes to regulatory projects. You cannot go beyond a certain date because it's affecting probably the whole country or even the whole region that you're staying in. So constraints, you always find them. And constraints, they are always captured also during the project charter. So you might be asking, what is a project charter? A project charter is a document that is used to approve or to authorize the start of a project, and it's also used to give authority to the project manager and also to the project sponsor. If you want to understand more about project charter, I've created a full video on project charter. You can also watch it on my channel. I'll also leave a link in the description below. So you should be able to understand the distinction between an assumption and a constraint. An assumption is something that is considered to be real, true, or even certain without providing proof or even demonstration. And then a constraint is something that is a limiting factor, something that is not going to give you more flexibility in terms of what you want to do in a project environment. For example, it could be a schedule limit, it could be a budget limit, it could be even a team size limit that can also come, it could be a technical limit. So constraints, they all come in different categories. So you could be asking, Oscar, at what point do we capture or do we create this assumption log? The assumption log is actually created during the initiation stage of the project. That is creation. Get this right. Creation is during initiation of the project. However, when it comes to updating assumption log, it's updated from the initiation of the project all the way up to the end of the project. So do not make a mistake I've seen with some other project managers in the field. They just create the assumption log initially just to demonstrate to either senior management or to the client that they have assumptions. And then throughout the project, they become or they claim to be busy, and then they forget or they intentionally do not update the assumption log. Assumption log is supposed to be updated from the beginning of the project, during the project, and also at the end of the project. So you could be asking, at what can cause these assumptions to be updated? There are so many points or phases in a project where this assumption has to be updated. For example, when you're planning, which means you've moved from initiation to planning, there are a lot of assumptions that you have to consider throughout the planning process. Or even when you're doing procurement, there are also certain assumptions that you put into consideration. For example, if it's a software development project, you might also consider that during testing or even during cutover. So there are quite a number of points in a project environment where you have to consider the assumptions. And you should always come back to the assumption log, update it, and validate it, assign it to someone else, make sure there's also a date to make sure that the validation is actually done. So assumption log is something created during initiation, updated all the way up to the end of the project. So let us understand and appreciate why it matters to have an assumption log. So the first point that you have to consider is to reduce risk. So once you assume something, it gives you an opportunity to actually analyze it, to actually validate it before it becomes a risk. I can give you a good example. You can assume that, let me give you an example of a software project. So you might assume that the old servers, they are going to be, or old infrastructure is going to be used as part of the new project. However, during the project, you might discover, or you can be advised by the technical team, that there's a compatibility issue, which means the previous infrastructure or the servers, they can't be used in the new project. Therefore, you're forced to go for procurement to make sure there's availability of the infrastructure that you're going to use to run the software. So this is how the risk comes into play. You are assuming that you're going to use the existing infrastructure, but now you're forced to go to procurement. So the risk is the project is going to be delayed, likely, or you're likely going to exceed your budget, or you're going to expand your budget. So assumption log is actually very important to reduce the risk. You also have to drive action. Assumption log is also very important to drive action. What do you mean by this? When we assume something, you come up with an action plan to validate it, and even the dates to validate it, so that you're quite sure whether you're going to be continuing with that assumption, or you're going to close it, or you're going to put in place, if it's a risk mitigation activities or measures, to make sure that if it changes, it doesn't affect the project. So that is quite important to understand, that a assumption log is also used to drive action. Then, especially during the initiation stage, where you're creating probably a project charter, or you're identifying some stakeholders, it's also very important to use assumptions for alignment, because either the organization senior management or program managers or portfolio managers, they want to appreciate what was the basis of your estimates, what was the basis of your documentation, what was the basis of your requirements collection, as an example. So assumption log can also be used for alignment. You were, for example, you were gathering some requirements, and you assumed that the people who are giving the requirements, they are competent enough or they're experienced enough to provide the requirements as a complete set. That's an assumption. Assuming you got some new members in a department who are supplying or who are giving requirements, then definitely that assumption might not be valid for some time. So it's also used for alignment. Do not make a mistake that I've seen with some other project managers. They just update assumption log just at the beginning of the project. Assumption log is actually a living document. What do we mean by living document? A living document it means it can be changed anytime. You don't need to go for change request to change assumptions. So it's one of the documents that is used during the project, and it's one of the documents that is also archived when the project is closed. So assumption is very important, because in the next project or as part of the organization, It can also be used to pick some of the lessons learned that you are going to use or to update as you close the project. So take the assumption log as a living document. It's something that can be updated from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe button, and the notification button so that you're the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It will also help the channel to produce more videos like this. So in this section of the video, we are going to clarify the main differences between assumption and also constraint. So let us go through them one by one, starting with assumptions, and then we also go through on the constraints. So in terms of assumption, it is considered to be true, but without proof. That is very, very important. Then it also comes from the project team. The assumptions should come from the project team. Then number 3, the assumptions can also come from any project document. For example, during initiation, you can start, during initiation, you can also have a project charter bringing in these assumptions. Or you can also have the stakeholder register also coming in as assumption, or stakeholder analysis matrix. So that is during initiation. During planning, it can even come from scope statement. You can also have some assumptions which are coming from procurement, that are coming from risk plans, quality plans, communication plans, and so on and so forth. Then an assumption should be progressively validated and eventually closed. So you cannot just capture an assumption, then you leave it like that. You have to make sure that it's validated. How do you validate? You assign a responsible part. You also assign a due date, and then make sure that it's closed. Once it's closed, it's closed. If it's not closed, it can be graduated or it can be upgraded to become a risk. So which means it's something that we're thinking it was going to remain true, but you're no longer certain or unsure. You're now unsure as to whether that is going to remain. So it end up becomes a risk. So let me give you an example. A vendor will deliver materials on time. This is an assumption. You're assuming all is well, or everything is going to work according to plan, and therefore the vendor is going to provide the materials on time. But anything can happen with the vendor. They can go bankrupt. They can have some other internal issues that might affect the material, even their sources, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the examples of an assumption that you can make. Now, let us cover what is a constraint in a project environment that you might also want to capture in the assumption log. So the first one is a constraint is a limiting factor on project execution. It's something that does not give you the flexibility that you want. For example, schedule, you might be told it must not exceed 18 months. The cost must not exceed 5 million, and so on and so forth. Then also is set by the customer sponsor or regulatory bodies. So normally a constraint is set by the customer or by the sponsor or even by the regulatory board. The sponsor might say the budget should not exceed, say, 200,000, or the customer might say the size of the product should not exceed, say, for example, 20 kgs, for example, if it's the weight. If it's the size, they might say 1 meter or 2 meters. So you also get such type of constraints from customers. And in some cases, it might even come from the regulatory board. They might say this kind of chemical that you might be producing as a product in a project, it must contain a certain structure. Otherwise, it becomes uncompliant with the regulatory. Or even the regulatory might give a constraint to say, your project should not exceed 2 months, or your project should not affect some environmental items or factors that are in consideration. So constraints can come from the customer, they can also come from the sponsor, they can also come from a regulatory authority. Typical example is we are talking of fixed budgets or predetermined milestones. There are certain milestones they might come as also constrained. You are told in 2 months, milestone 1 must be finished. In the next 6 weeks, another one to be finished. In 1 year, you finish the other one. So all those ones are also constraints that you can also have in a project environment. For example, the budget can be kept at 500,000. Okay, the team members can be kept at 20. You should not exceed 20 team members, or even you might be told that the period should not exceed 2 years. So these are some of the examples of constraints that you can find in a project environment. In this section of the video, I'm going to take you through the understanding of the status value or values of assumption. So let's go through that. So the first one is when you say the status is active, it means the assumption is currently under consideration. It has been identified but not yet validated or resolved. And then when it's first documented, so the action here is to assign the responsible party to set due date, define validation actions. So if it is active, it means it's something that is still considering. You assumed it, you still need to validate and make sure that it's closed. Then the second one is transferred. So the assumption has been escalated. It has become an issue or risk that needs to be managed via the issue log or the risk register. So when the assumption cannot be validated or it cannot be proven or is proven to be false, then it has to be either logged as a risk, which means it's a future event that can happen, which can also affect the objectives or the goals of the project. If you want to understand more about risk management in a project, I've created a video on risk management. You can also watch it on my channel. I'll also leave a link in the description below. So assumption can also be escalated to become a risk, or it can even move to be an issue. In case it was assumed that the machinery was going to be available on time, and now you have received some additional information from the supplier that it might be delayed by another week or 2 weeks, then it becomes an issue. So you escalate or you move it from being an assumption to becoming an issue. Then when it's closed, the assumption has been validated and confirmed. It is no longer active and no further action is required. So when the assumption has been proven true or resolved, then you close it. You document the validation evidence in comments and mark it as closed. So when you make an assumption, you still need to validate it. Okay? Say for example, you are running a project. Your assumption is your team, they have the right technical skills to deliver the project or to make sure the deliverables of the project are according to the acceptance criteria. So that's an assumption. So if that is an assumption, you still need to validate it. How do you validate? You might even have some interviews with the team. You can even brainstorm on some solutions with the team to see if you have got these skills. So there are likely going to be two outcomes. When you have the discussions with the team, they might prove that they have the skills. Therefore, you close that assumption. Then the second outcome is you might have the discussion with the team. Then you prove that they don't have the skills. So that becomes actually an issue. You put it as an issue or you put it as a risk, depending on the circumstances that you have validated the assumption. So assuming you've proven the assumption to be valid, then you close it. If you prove it that it's false, then you have to move it to become a risk or even an issue. So you log it in the risk log or you put it in the issue log. So in this section of the video, we are going to look at how do you complete the assumption log in a project environment, which is very, very important. There's no way you're going to run a project without completing this assumption log. Remember, you complete it from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project. So let us go through the steps that you have to go through to complete this. We are going to look at 5 of them, these steps. So the first step is to identify assumptions and constraints. So you need to gather inputs from the project charter, from the team discussions, and also stakeholder interviews. You review all the project documents for stated or implied assumption. So it's quite important that the first stage that you have to do is to identify the assumptions and also the constraints. You gather this information from project charter and other documents that you might have. This could be agreements. Probably the project had some procurement process and there were some agreements or contracts before the project was initiated or approved. So therefore, you can even take the assumptions from those particular documents. The second one is assign IDs and also categories. Each assumption should be traceable throughout the project. So how do you make that possible? You have to make sure that there's an ID which is assigned to each and every assumption. And also you categorize the assumption. Is it something technical? Is it something that is financial? Or is it something that is maybe a global thing, and so on and so forth. So some of these categories, you come up with them as you go through the project. Then the third one is you need to write clear descriptions. Use one sentence per entry and also state what is assumed or constrained is clear, unambiguous, and also avoid vague statements. So assumptions should be very clear. Anyone in the project, whether it's a project member, project sponsor, board member, they should be able to take the assumption log, read, and to some extent understand. So don't try to put some vague languages in the assumption log. Make sure it's something very simple and very, very clear. Then step number 4, you need to assign owner and set the date. Name a specific person responsible for validating the assumption and set realistic due dates before the assumption affects project planning decisions. So when you are creating or you are completing the assumption log, make sure that you have a responsible part, a name of a person. It's I've seen some other project managers making mistakes. They just put the department name to say, for example, ICT. There's no one called ICT. If it's possible, try to put the actual name of the person who's going to validate that assumption, who's going to prove, who's going to make sure that the assumption is something that can be used throughout the project, or something that can be proven untrue and therefore moved to become a risk. So there must be a responsible part set up, and also the due date should also be there. Then the last one, which is the 5th step, is to define the actions. List specific steps needed to validate, obtain confirmation from vendor, review contract, conduct testing, and get sponsor sign-off. So there must be some very well-defined action items to validate these assumptions. And these action items are going to make the assumption either closed, become active, or escalated to a risk, or even an issue log. So it's quite important that you define the actions that you have to take on that particular assumption. If you want to dive deeper into understanding and appreciating what is a project management, I've created for you a very comprehensive ebook, which you can access using the link in the description below. In this section of the video, we are now going to have a look at a symbol of an assumption log, so that whatever we've discussed earlier, it actually makes sense. So let us go through this symbol so that we appreciate how it looks like, or we feel how it looks like to have an assumption log in a project environment. So let us have a look at this example where we are implementing a software implementation project. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, we have the ID and assumption, just say A001. You can put whatever ID you want. You can also use the organization's naming convention to come up with this. Or maybe we talk of the categories. On categories, we have, say for example, technical category. We also have a resource category. We also have budget category, external or internal category. You can also put it as a schedule category. So when it comes to the assumptions or the constraints, which we said it must be well documented. Say for example, we take assumption 001. It means that the development server will be available from project kickoff. That's an assumption. So who is going to be responsible for that? It's going to be the IT manager. And what is the due date? Remember, you have to put the due date. It has to be October 1st. And what is the status of the assumption log? Is active. You can also put the additional column we discussed earlier, where you put the comments. Then if we look at assumption number 2, which is the resource, we have 3 full-time employees, FTE, developers, available full-time for 6 months. That's an assumption. So who is going to be responsible for this? This is going to be the HR director, as an example. And when is it going to be due? It's going to be due on 15th of September. And it's also active, which means the assumption is still under consideration. Then you also have the budget, as an example. The budget kept at 500,000. It's a constraint. It's not so much of an assumption. So who is responsible for that? Is the sponsor. And do we have a specific date? In some cases, it might not have a specific date because it's already known. So it becomes there's no due date. But in most cases, try by all means to put the due date. Then that is active. We look at external, okay, which is second from the bottom. We have the vendor API will remain stable throughout integration. That's an assumption. So a responsible party is going to be the technical lead, and it's going to be due by 20th of October. This is transferred. So remember the 3 status we discussed on assumption. It's active, transferred, or it's closed. So if you look at assumption A003, this has been transferred. It means it has not been proven to be true. It has been proven to be false. So it's being moved to a risk log or even an issue log, depending. It cannot be on both. Risk is something that is expected to happen in future, but an issue is something that has already happened, or it's a risk that has already materialized. So this one is transferred. Then if you look at the last one, which is A004, which is a schedule category, it means the assumption here is user acceptance testing, which is UAT sign-off, requires only 2 weeks. Then the responsible party is the quality assurance lead, QA lead, is supposed to be due by 10th of November, and it has been closed. So which means if the assumption has been closed, it means it has been validated and it has been proven to be true. Remember, when you're making assumptions, you're not providing any proof, you're not providing any demonstration. So during the project, you still need to provide proof or demonstration to validate that assumption. So if you were able to prove the assumption to be true, then it becomes closed on the assumption log. If you want me to create more videos based on what we have covered in this video, you can also reach out to me, or you can let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.